Hi, welcome to the first of 4 seminars on addiction. My name is David Outridge. I'm a medical specialist in drug and alcohol. The aim of these talks is to improve knowledge about addiction in order to help those people who are experiencing addiction and their loved ones to navigate their way forwards. I'd like to acknowledge the Port Stephens Community Drug Action Team for sponsoring this series of talks, and also the Samaritans Foundation Recovery Point program with whom I'm associated. This talk will look at how to recognise addiction, a look at the brain and how habit formation occurs, how substances produce addiction, and who is at risk of addiction. Firstly, what is addiction? And I'll start with a clinical definition, which is really a description of signs and symptoms. And this list has been prepared by an international group, and it's called DSM-5. These 11 criteria can be grouped into 3 main headings. These are loss of control, objective evidence of problems related to use, and feelings related to use, that is craving, tolerance and withdrawal. But starting first with loss of control. Signs of loss of control could include failed attempts to cut down or stop using. Secondly, using despite knowing that it's causing harm, or using despite recurring social embarrassment, or on any occasion of use, using a larger amount or for a longer duration than intended. So instead of having 1 drink as intended, the person ends up having quite a few more. Under the second grouping, under objective problems, this could include use in hazardous situations such as drink or drug driving, neglecting responsibilities, roles and interests, a deterioration in social or interpersonal relationships, and excessive amounts of time spent seeking or getting, using and recovering from substance use. Under the subjective feelings group is cravings, which is really the inability to think of anything else but obtaining that substance at a given time. Tolerance and withdrawal are features of using substances, whether they're addictive substances or whether they're prescribed substances such as antidepressants. Tolerance and withdrawal does not apply to prescribed medications. So we looked at the description of addiction in terms of our behaviours. Let's look at the biology of addiction, and to understand that we need to look at some basic mechanisms of the brain around learning, particularly conditioned learning as opposed to applied learning. Conditioned learning is automatic, it happens without us knowing it, and it occurs more or less at a gut level, whereas applied learning is the sort of learning we do at school or doing courses, and it involves the application of our attention to a given subject. So we'll look at the brain regions involved in learning, both the conditioned learning and applied learning, and look at the brain biology as it applies to addiction. First, I'd like to look at learning by association, and you've probably heard of Pavlov and his dogs and the use of ringing the bell to produce salivation in the dogs. Let's look at this video, and this learning by association is called conditioned learning, classical conditioning.
As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened.
So we've seen from Pavlov's experiment that that there are unlearned stimuli or things that produce a response in us, such as food relieving hunger, and produce, say, salivation or pleasant anticipation. And then there are associated things that happen around the presentation of food, which can bring on similar responses, anticipation, pleasant anticipation, and salivation in the case of the dog. Let's look at a human example of the same thing. And for example, again, the food relieving hunger, that's an unlearned response. And just say a little child sees their big brother climb up to get a biscuit from a tin, and big brother shares it with them, and they enjoy the sweet biscuit and relieve their hunger. And so there's a link set up. Hunger becomes linked in that child's mind with the biscuit tin, especially just before dinner. So there are other associations in that scenario, and one is a behaviour that is seen, not just that the biscuit tin and the biscuit relieves hunger, but there's the climbing up, and also a belief, and right or wrong, that it is okay to get a biscuit from the tin, which his mother may influence him in a different direction later on. But this associated learning is something that does drive behaviours. And let's look at the next slide, which is about how to understand automatic behaviours, that is, behaviours and beliefs that have been set up through these associations. So a way to conceptualise this basic learning is that, and using a different example, we have an activating event, which, for example, is thirst in this example, a behaviour or a belief response, which is, for example, to turn the tap on or to seek a tap, and the belief that this tap has good water, which may not be true in all cases. There may be taps for fuel or gas, or water may not be good. So there's a certain thought aspect to the response. And then there's a consequence. In the case of being good water, there's a relief of thirst, which gives rise to pleasure. The concept here is that this ABC, or activator, behaviour, belief, and consequence, is set up and established through reinforcement. So when there's a pleasant response to a behaviour or a belief, then it is reinforced and leads to a more likely occurrence of that behaviour or belief in the future. This is simple biology, and it happens at a gut level. And the flip side also is that if the consequences has negative feelings, that is, it's more of a punishment or a negative effect, then it will make it less likely for those behaviours and beliefs to occur next time for the same event. Let's look at an example from nature now. We have a lion which is hungry. It's has observed in the past from its as a cub watching its parents wait near a waterhole at sunset. Other animals come along to drink. They catch their prey. They relieve their hunger. Without associated learning, creatures would not be able to stay alive. They would not remember how to seek for food. They wouldn't learn the whole set of behaviours that is associated with staying alive and meeting those basic needs of thirst, hunger, safety, and reproduction. So this mechanism is, because it's involved in our survival, it's a very powerful mechanism. And as we'll see later, it's a mechanism that can be hijacked by substances. So let's look at the brain structure as relates to our subject of learning and addiction. The frontal lobe and the limbic system are the two main areas that we're looking at. The frontal lobe we'll call from here on the smart brain, and the limbic system we'll call the animal brain. The limbic system we share with mammals. It is the part where our fundamental drives are sensed and basic behaviours are learned. So the drive for relieving thirst and hunger and reproduction, safety, social dominance, and that sort of thing is held within the limbic system. The wavy surface of the brain, called the cerebral cortex, is really the computer part of the brain, and it does the number crunching, if you like. It also is where sight is perceived. The concept of space and language is also computed there. If you are running to catch a ball, your cerebral cortex will be doing multiple calculations as you're running towards the ball, assisting you to know exactly where to be and how to intercept that ball. The frontal lobe is much more to do with your higher functions of a sense of who you are, higher judgment, weighing up things, deciding what is important, paying attention, giving attention to certain things. Your sense of morality is, and those kind of things are function within the frontal lobe. It takes the longest time to develop, and it's the part of the brain that's the most highly developed, if you like. And it's the balance between this frontal lobe and the limbic system which really determines our behaviours. It's a balance between those higher considerations and basic animal instincts. Looking at the animal brain or the limbic system in more detail, this is shows the three-dimensional view of it, and it's to do with basic learning, as we said, reward and punishment. If you like, it's the inner caveman. It's the not very smart part of our brain, which essentially deals with impulses for safety, protection, reproduction, relieving thirst and hunger. And it is modulated, if you like, by the frontal lobe, which more or less keeps those impulses in an appropriate balance. So looking at the frontal lobe, all mammals have a frontal lobe more or less developed, and these frontal lobes have specialised functions for different animals. For example, a dog would have certain thoughts, if you like, to do with smells and possibly linked by images of other dogs. That image might be a composite of a visual image, something to do with their movements, something to do with their smells in particular, a certain spatial location of where that individual was, but it wouldn't have thoughts, logical thoughts, or necessarily verbal thoughts. A chimpanzee has a more highly developed frontal lobe, but would not be able to understand, for example, poetry or higher judgments. They do have specialized abilities that we don't, for example, the ability to remember long sequences of numbers, and this may have some sort of role in their natural environment, for example, keeping track of all the individuals in their group as they traverse through the bush. But humans have a highly developed frontal lobe, which incorporates everything that is being put into them, if you like, during their growing up years, and leads to a high level of control of the lower levels of the brain, which are to do with the impulses and if you like, considerations that can't be got out of hand. So, for example, reproduction impulse can't be let run uncontrolled, otherwise it would interfere with social interactions with other individuals. But our frontal lobe is where our higher intellect and judgment occurs. It takes a long time to develop, possibly 25 to 30 years in humans. So the frontal lobe is the smart brain. It's the executive of the organisation. It's the executive part of the brain. That is, it makes the decisions. It initiates overall direction of that individual. It subordinates other parts of the brain to its purposes. It adapts to new situations, just like a company that is viable has to adapt. If the executive of that company doesn't adapt to changing situations, then that company will go out of business eventually. In the same way, the frontal lobe, if it's not functioning properly, puts the individual at risk, and as we'll see later, can lead to addiction. A nice analogy I use is the horse and rider, where the smart brain is like the rider of the horse, the animal brain is like the horse. The smart brain is in control, the rider is in control of the horse. If the horse is in control, then it's just wandering around aimlessly, doing its own thing, stopping to have having something to eat here, interacting with other horse there. For the purpose of the rider, he has to be awake and alert, and in the case of say attention deficit disorder, the smart brain isn't fully alert, leading to the animal brain having more control. So this is a slide showing composite scans of the brain during development, showing the maturing that occurs in the brain over 20 years. A lot of things can go wrong during that 20 years, from the time of being inside the mother's womb through to through the age of 20, and it can include things like viral infections, poor nutrition, an adverse social environment, lack of basic emotional needs being met, damage by trauma or substances. All these things can affect the maturing of the frontal lobe. Remembering the frontal lobe is the key executive part of the brain. It leads to the control of impulses, and therefore this is a key part of the development of addiction. If impulse control is poor, then addiction will have a much greater tendency to occur. We'll pause here, and when we come back, we'll look at how substances produce addiction, what the effect of dopamine in the brain, and how addiction hijacks the dopaminergic system.